Okay, this is going to be a walkthrough on how to make a book in Blender. This was brought on by a user on Reddit called What's Up Doc, and they wanted to know how to do this. So I'm going to start by getting my cube and just making a quick inset to get a basic book shape. And then I start by adding some loop cuts and scaling them flat, just to create a space where I can create a lip in the edge of the book. And just adding loop cuts and scaling them as I need them. Then I add some loop cuts around the spine, and then in a second I'm going to flick on proportional editing after I've selected the end edge, and that's just going to let me create a curve to the back of the book, which is good. So that's our basic book shape made. Then I just add some materials really quickly, just so that I know where the cover is and where the pages are. That will be useful later. So now we're going to jump over into Affinity Designer. You could do this in anything else, Inkscape, GIMP, Photoshop, but I'm just creating with some guides the basic outline and guides of a book cover, and then I'm just adding in some text and working on just basic layout like you really would for a book. The reason we're doing this is to create a mat for when later on, when we make our two textures for the cover of the book, we're going to need something to define which texture is showing through where. So this is going to be just a basic mat to do that. Yeah, you could make this more elaborate than I'm making here. I'm just doing something pretty basic to show you the process of doing this. Okay, so now we've jumped over into Substance Designer. There are other tools available that you can use to do this, but I'm starting by just adding lots of noises. Here I'm using cell noises and multiplying them together to create the basis of a leather texture. And just adding the noises that represent the shapes that I'm going for. Then I add in a Verneuil cells, and we're going to use that a little bit later. We add some edge erosion to that, and just then a little bit later we're going to warp that to create the cracks and seams that you see on a piece of leather. And then I'm just adding these all together. If you were using GIMP, you'd use this in layers, and then just do exactly what I'm doing here, but you would create merge down layers to get to where you want it to be with these base textures. Obviously in Substance Designer or another node-based texturing setup, it's a little bit easier to see what you're doing because you've got a shader there loaded, and it really helps with the visualization. So then I just blend the cracks into the base leather, and then I hop online to find a texture of some real leather, and I use a gradient map to just grab the colors of real leather to get the right hues that we want for something leathery. And then I just play around with the roughness values of the texture until I've got a good sheen and a good matteness underneath. Okay, so now I'm creating the foil. I go through the same process to create a metallic foil. And what's necessary to know when you're making a texture like this is the process in which a book like this is actually made, which is a form of pressure embossing where you have a sheet of leather and then you have, usually it will be powder coated with glue, and then you will have a piece of gold leaf laid on the top of it, or copper leaf, and then you will use a heated press with something to push down. So that's what I'm doing with this mat now, is I'm just using it to create that little lip where in a real book the press will have bonded the metal and the glue and the leather together, and it will create a curved lip on the outside for a little bit of depth on a book of this age. So then we jump back over into Blender and we just start setting up our texturing. So this is the really crucial bit. You're going to want to load in an image here. And that's that image I was talking about just a little bit before. So I set up two shaders, so I'll be able to see if they need reversing or not. And then I just add in as an image texture the mat that we created before. That's really the basis of any kind of texture like this. If you don't have a good mat, you're not going to get a good texture for something like this. So yeah, I just load that in, and then we can see immediately when I've loaded it in, you can see now that we have two distinct shaders operating on the object. And then I just play a little bit around with the automatic UV unwrapping just to see if one fits. In this case it doesn't. So then instead of using any kind of UV unwrapping or trying to warp the image to fit, I just start to go into an orthographic mode, and I select the faces that I want and I project my texture on from view, which is just going to give me a flat projection from the plane I'm looking at, and then it's just a matter of scaling and moving the texture around until it fits in a nice way. I did have a little bit of trouble next on the spine of this book. Initially I decided to fit the back spine to the overlap of the texture by scaling it, but then I decided to backtrack on that. You can see here, this is where I'm sort of making the mistake, is I take away too many faces there, and then pretty much immediately now after when I was shooting this, you can see me here trying to match that just tiny bit up using a scale, and it wasn't working for me. And probably it wouldn't work for you either, and you should just do what I did the second time around here, which is go in, reselect where that overhang is, and make sure that when you're covering a curved surface, you're covering the entire angle of it. That's really a useful thing to do. So yeah, here I'm just rotating that around, and this time scaling it and placing it into a much better place than I did initially. So we're pretty much done with this part of the process. So now we're about to jump over into actually loading up our textures. So we just come in and we add in a fresh image texture, and we work on we should be working on our normal map first, adding in a normal node. And then you need to make sure that the bump mapping is set to non-color data for your initial image texture. And I just go in and add in all those textures we exported from Substance Designer a little while ago. For both the leather and the embossing, and we can see here it's already starting to come together, and it's starting to look bookish. But there's still a few little problems. Really it's just a matter of playing around with a multiply between our roughness and our normal map value until the colors shine through like they should and blend together a bit. If you wanted to make that a little bit easier on yourself, you might create a second version of your mat specifically for this part of the process that also had a slight bit of blur on it, so you were sort of blurring those textures together a little bit on the edge, but that would reduce in crispness a little bit, so that would depend on what you wanted to do. So the last stage here is in the pages that we need to do. So I jump back over into Substance Designer after I create a small backdrop for the book. And the reason I'm making this backdrop isn't necessarily because I'm going to use it as a rendering tool in this tutorial. It's just so that I can see how the texture is going to react in an environment where there's other geometry around it, because otherwise I might be looking at my texture in an environment where there's all this black body stuff around it, and I might be fooling myself in terms of how the colors are reacting to light in an environment. So it is really useful to have some surfaces there where light is bouncing off. So back in Substance Designer, you could really do this in any application that could just render you out some straight fibers. I do make a bump map texture for them, but I don't end up using it because it's not really necessary. So yeah, I just then, back in Blender, I import the texture I just made and do that last little piece of UV unwrapping, and then we're almost there and it almost looks bookish, but there's one small problem, and that's that the corners of the book are too cornery. So I'm looking at it and it doesn't look right, and that's because, again, when these kind of books are made, they're made out of a piece of wood that has the corners sanded down so it won't cut through the leather at the corners of the book. So the way I fix that is I just tap into edit mode, and then I'm just gonna get the edge of where where those corners of my book are, and I'm just going to add a bevel there to just make it look like the cover of the book is, or the leather is wrapping around the cover board of the book, rather than they're coming to like a really ugly point. Especially if you look at old books like this, you can see that a lot of the time also the pages are sanded down to that curve. So I do put that in. That's about it, and that's a book. Hopefully a convincing book. Thanks for watching.